Yeah, I guess you've noticed I changed the due dates on stuff between now and the end of the semester, but we have, what, 3 weeks? So we do chapters 8 and 9 this week, 10 and 11 next week, and 12 and 13 the last week. And then you have till, I think it's Wednesday after the last class period to get your work, all your work turned in.
Thank you.
And we were talking before class started about the research paper. And if you pick because the paper can be on any topic in geography, so if you pick a topic and start researching it and say, whoops, I just exhausted this topic and I only have 6 pages, then if it's supposed to be 13 pages of research, just pick another topic and research that one and see, and just keep picking topics and add them to your paper till you get 13 pages. Because it's just a matter of looking up stuff in geography, and this geography covers the whole waterfront here. And in fact, I just said before class, if anybody wants to know how to say to somebody, that's a cool shirt you're wearing, in about 14 different languages, just ask Anna. She knows all about it. She found all that stuff on the internet, in her internet research. Wasn't that where it was? Mm-hmm. And it was this cool stuff. And I'm enjoying reading your discussions. I'm actually having fun writing my own discussions on these topics. So I hope you're keeping up with that discussion page on Canvas and filling that stuff in. Yours don't have to be quite as lengthy as mine. I just get a little carried away. In chapter 8, page 295, we're going to cover chapter 8 and 9 today in our 3 class periods. And it starts out talking about food riots. This chapter is on the human food supply, and it talks about in 2008. So I thought, well, the reason I use an older textbook is so you don't have to pay a lot of money for your book, because the topics stay the same. It's just that sometimes there's current information out there. So look what I did. I just went to, gotcha, Christiana. Why do I say that wrong? Because I'm from Oklahoma. Christiana. When you go down to see the Christmas lights, do you go to the plaza or the plaza? Plaza?
Oh no, I've never been down there. You've never been to the plaza? No. I should go.
So we're on page 295 talking about the human food supply. And it talks about hunger riots or food riots in 2008. But again, as I said, we use an older book, so you don't have to pay as much for your textbook, but you have to go to the internet to get current information. So here we are. I just Googled, what did I Google? I think I Googled food riots. And it has a list of food riots in the set. Oh, it should say, read this, food riots may occur when there's a shortage or unequal distribution of food. Causes can be food price rises, harvest failures, incompetent food storage, transportation problems, food speculation. What? Somebody speculating there's going to be, they announced a hurricane coming to Texas. Some guy in Texas said, hey, everybody's going to have to fill up with gas. We can double the price of gas and make a ton of money this weekend while people are leaving town. No, that's called price gouging, and you can get in trouble for that. Speculating on what food is going to be popular, and I guess if you were in the egg business, this would be the time to sell a bunch of eggs because of Easter. Hoarding, people buying stuff and keeping it for whatever reason. Poison foods, attacks by pests, and a rise in global food prices led to riots in various countries, and a similar crisis recurred in 2010 and 2012. And the book talks about one in 2008. So let's just run down here and look at some of these. 19th century food riots, the Salt Riot in Moscow. The Bread Riot, the Novgorod Uprising of 1650. Russia bought grain from Sweden and raised the price of bread, and everybody went bonkers in Russia. 18th century, the Boston Bread Riot, the Flour War. Luxury wallpaper. The factory employed about 300 people. The riots were one of the first instances of violence during the French Revolution. 19th century, flour riot, potato riot, southern bread riots. The 20th century, meat riots, potato riots, rice riots. Egyptian bread riots. '21st century, a shortage of food in Bengal. And have you heard anything in the news about what's going on in Venezuela? Their economy has collapsed and inflation is unbelievably high, and there aren't any foods available. So people are leaving Venezuela because you can't find anything. On page 295, about the middle of the left-hand column, it says the amount of food produced in the world is more than enough to feed everyone. Then what's the problem? Well, we produce a lot more food in this country than we can use. Were any of you told when you were growing up, clean your plate? There are starving children someplace else in the world? Where were those starving children?
Africa.
Africa?
Mm-hmm.
China? I was told China's where the starving people were. I don't know why, but it's just like, so it's like, well, if we have enough food to feed everybody, what's going on? Well, how do you get the food from one country to the other? I mean, do any of you work at a fast food restaurant? Do you have any idea how much food they throw away at a fast food restaurant? They put stuff up there on the shelf so people it'll be ready as soon as they drive through, so they predict how much will be sold. They cook it, they put it in a warmer. It can only stay there so many minutes before they have to throw it out. I'm thinking, why don't they just take all that food they're throwing out that's still edible and give it to the mission to give to poor people downtown? Any idea why they don't do that? What, they want those poor people to buy hamburgers? They're not going to buy them. Apparently, they're trying to avoid lawsuits where people would eat a McDonald's hamburger that had gone beyond its useful lifetime and get sick and sue McDonald's. See, I'm thinking, if you're giving food away, people aren't going to sue you, are they, for your free food you gave them? Well, only in America do we do stuff like that. It also says on page 295, for years, wealthier countries told developing countries to specialize in their economics around goods for export and then to use that money to buy food and other basic needs from the world markets. So the fields in these poor countries were converted to crops for export and no longer provided a complete meal, food for the people who lived in that community. and those people now rely on food imports to eat. And in 2007, the price of food traded on the world markets skyrocketed as production levels began to fall while demand and shipping costs increased. So it's like, well, you didn't tell us the price was going to go out of sight. I mean, what would happen if you had to pay $5 a pound for tomatoes? Any of you enjoy eating tomatoes? You don't. Do you know the difference between the taste of a tomato grown in your garden and one bought at the grocery store? Which one's better?
The one from your garden.
So if they charged $5 a pound for tomatoes, and you wanted tomatoes for sandwiches this summer, what would you do? Yeah. Would you go buy some tomato plants? Say, I don't have a garden. You don't need a garden. I lived in a tiny little apartment when my wife and I first got married, and we went on the east side of the building where the sun would shine early in the morning, and we planted 3 little tomato plants right next to our house and had all the tomatoes we could eat, and we're giving them away to people. It doesn't take that much to raise some of this stuff. Some of it is more work, but tomatoes, they will just pretty much, if you don't believe this, I would suggest you go get a tomato plant and plant it next to the fence in your yard, someplace where it'll get plenty of sun, and just water it and watch it grow and start hauling in tomatoes. Say, well, what if I live someplace where I can't plant tomatoes? Where could you live that you couldn't plant a tomato?
Antarctica.
Where?
Antarctica.
Oh, possibly. That's right. That's right. Or even Alaska. Say, well, what if I live in an apartment downtown? Then you get a little round container, fill it up with dirt, and plant a tomato on your patio or on your balcony for your apartment. Well, maybe there's a rule against planting tomatoes and you just have to do without. And can you see where if enough people got upset about the prices they were charging at the store for tomatoes, that's outrageous, so let's just break into the stores and steal all the tomatoes. Have a tomato riot. Probably you won't see a riot over tomatoes because people could live without those, but bread and meat and milk and that kind of thing, rice and wheat that are staples in life, you pretty much have to have those. And if there's a shortage because of all the problems mentioned here on the internet, or if the prices go too high because of what it costs to ship them and somebody's trying to make too much money off of this deal, then you're probably going to be faced with a riot. Page 296 talks about food supplies over the past 200 years. Well, let's look at this map here on page 296 and 297. It talks about the world of agriculture. Okay, let's just look first at the kind of chalky white region. What's the label for that region? A lot of South America and a lot of Australia. And a lot of northern Canada. Can you see that on page 297? Non-agricultural regions. You get that close to the North Pole, you can't grow things up there. The brown is irrigated areas and dry lands. Did you know here in the Midwest, did you see on that picture on page 296 in the United States, there's a whole bunch of irrigated land? Or is that someplace else? what's irrigated and what's prairie cereals? Irrigated's in South America and prairie cereals are in the Midwest. But don't we have some irrigation going on here? Yeah, but they're talking about irrigation in dry lands. I mean, you don't get a lot of rain in western Kansas. That's why it's called dry land farming. But if you drill a well and hook up an irrigation system, you will have a lot more productive crops. So we do a lot of irrigation in the Great Plains area, even though we raise a lot of cereal grains without it, just because irrigation makes your land more productive. It looks like Australia doesn't have very much productive land for crops. Looks like they've got a little bit of Mediterranean mixed grains and fruits and a little bit of, is that little brown stripe on the side? Is that prairie cereals or is that irrigated areas? I think that's prairie cereals, and then plantation agriculture in part of Australia. The United States is a pretty rich agriculturally country. And by the way, so is Northern and Eastern Europe. And Southern Europe is the Mediterranean area, where they grow a lot of stuff that they trade with the people in Northern Europe. Nomadic herding, which means they move their livestock from place to place because they eat up all the grass in one place. So it's not the most productive land. And low technology subsistence, again, not the most productive land. And notice how much of Africa is nomadic herding and low technology subsistence. And that's also true over in China. Which says we need to be careful here in America about being too critical of other parts of the world where they don't have all the natural benefits to promote agriculture like we have here. You can live about any place in the United States and plant a garden right next to your house, right next to your garage. You could plant a garden right next to the fence with your neighbor and then share the stuff that grows in your garden with them. The only place you might get in trouble is if you live in Peoria, Illinois. I found that out the hard way. When I lived in Peoria, there was a little strip of land between our garage and the fence that was a perfect place to plant a garden. I planted a garden there, and the city workers came by, knocked on my door, and said I was going to get a ticket for having weeds growing in my yard. I'm going, those are not weeds, those are tomato plants, and that's a garden. Well, he said, you're not allowed to have any plants growing more than 3 or 4 inches tall in your yard. And I go, what? If I hadn't moved away, I probably would be trying to change the law in Peoria so every little household, no matter how small their lot or their yard, could have a little bit of a garden. In Ukraine, it's really cool. In Ukraine, everybody uses their yard for a garden. Page 298 shows a picture of where our favorite foods came from. And I'm looking at grapes. I'm looking at the Mediterranean on this picture, and I'm saying celery and grapes and cattle and lettuce and barley and dates. I don't care for garlic or goat or olives or lentils, but if you do, then say, hey, that's where some of my favorite foods came from. From Southwest Asia, barley, beans, and beets, and fruits, and grapes, and oats, and onions, and wheat, and carrots. I'm only reading the ones that I like. From north central China, apricots, barley, buckwheat, cabbage, peaches, plums, and soybeans. From southern and southeastern Asia, bananas. Do we get our bananas from southeastern Asia? Anyone know where the bananas come from in the grocery store? Well, check it out. I'm looking at peaches, one of my favorite things to eat. And I buy a can of them from Hy-Vee. I put on the discussion page. And I called Hy-Vee and said, hey, it says here these peaches were canned in Des Moines, Iowa. And they said, no, they're not canned in Des Moines. They're distributed from Des Moines, Iowa. I said, I'm going to say, I've been to Des Moines and I never saw a peach cannery there. And they said, if you'll give me the number off of the can, that code that you scan, they could tell me where the peaches came from. And I gave them the code and they told me the peaches came from a cannery in California. And they said, and if your can says made in the USA, then that means all the peaches came from California. But sometimes when they have like a drought in California or the peach crop fails, they buy peaches from China and ship them to California and then can them. But if that happens, they won't put made in the USA on the can or product of USA. They'll sometimes put product of China, or sometimes they just won't put anything. So even though peaches started in north central China, now they're raised, you can raise peaches. There used to be a peach orchard close by here, but the people who owned it sold the land and they bulldozed it and turned it into a housing development. What's that all about? If I want to buy peaches now, I have to go south, down toward the Arkansas border. If I want fresh, tree-ripened peaches. Southern and southeastern Asia, bananas, breadfruit, citrus fruits, coconuts, cucumbers, lettuce, pig, pork, pulses. Anyone know what pulses are? Google pulses and what will it tell you? That those are all those beans. Sugar cane, tea, water buffalo. So, where do you think we get, maybe turn back to the other page for a minute. I guess we better look at eastern Brazil. No, let's look at East Africa. Cotton, coffee, barley, wheat, sorghum. West Africa, melons, rice and yams. Eastern Brazil, beans, Brazil nuts. Is cacao, is that chocolate? Peanuts, pineapple. Andean uplands. I don't see anything. Oh, tomatoes. Tomatoes, potatoes, pumpkin, Mesoamerican, beans, maize, squash, turkey. North America, I don't go for artichoke. Blueberry, cranberry. That's about it. Hey, wait a minute. One of my favorite foods is strawberries, and I didn't see them on here. So I Googled strawberries, and guess what it said? The strawberry that we're familiar with originated in the Virginia area of the United States and was taken from there back to Europe. So I'm wondering, did the Native Americans on the eastern seaboard, did they nurture strawberries and, what do we call them, cultivated them to turn strawberries from some little wild berry into the ones that we're used to eating, and then they were sold to Europe? I don't remember reading that. Do you remember reading anything like that in your geography books when you were younger? Gotcha, Adrian. What I remember reading is that when Europeans came to America, they discovered tobacco. And they started raising tobacco on plantations and shipping it back to England. And all of a sudden, the Native Americans introduced Europeans to smoking tobacco. And now we have a tobacco smoking problem in our society. So maybe that's payback by Native Americans for the way we treated them. Transportation and storage. Have you ever bought fruit at the grocery store in the wintertime and you took it home and tasted it and it tasted like propane? Oh, I'll bet you don't know what propane smells like. Do you?
Yeah.
Have you smelled propane? Have you ever tasted fruit that kind of had a little bit of a propane flavor to it? Sometimes when fruit is kept in cold storage, it develops a taste, a funny taste, that diminishes the quality of eating it. And transporting it, if they picked fresh peaches in Arkansas and hauled them to Kansas City to sell them, by the time they got here in the crates, all stacked up 4 or 5 deep, they would all be bruised, and by the time you went in the store to buy them, they would be so bad you wouldn't want to pay for them. So what do they do in Arkansas? They pick the peaches when they're green and hard like a rock and put them in a box and then send them up here. And then when you buy them, they tell you, put them in a paper bag when you get home and let them ripen. But they don't taste as good as the ones that are ripened on the tree. But if you want to go to Arkansas and buy your own tree-ripened peaches, you can't stack them too high because they'll bruise each other. You can only lay them flat in great big containers. And when you put them in your car, I put them in our station wagon to haul them back up here. My wife and my daughters went nuts with the smell of fresh peaches just filling up the car. They wanted to eat them all before we got home. And I said, no, no, no. And when we got home, we fixed them. We processed them like we used to do peaches when I was a kid. We dipped them in hot water and blanched them and then pulled the skins off and cut them in quarters and put them in containers and sprinkled some fruit fresh on them. We didn't do that when I was a kid because we didn't care what they looked like. But for city folks, you have to make them look pretty, so you put fruit fresh on them. And then all winter long, after church, we would invite our friends over to our house for ice cream with fresh peaches. Everybody went on and on over those peaches. The problem is, once you've tasted tree-ripened peaches, you can't find a peach at the store that tastes good enough to satisfy your appetite for peaches. That's probably true about anything. I mean, I eat tomatoes from the store because that's all I can get. But in the summertime, if I don't grow my own tomatoes, which I don't anymore, because I have so many neighbors who grow them and then put up little stands, where I can buy them for 25 cents a pound or 50 cents a pound. I let the neighbors raise the tomatoes, and I just go by their little stand and buy them from them. Page 300, left-hand column. There's a picture. Here's what it says. Modern techniques of food transportation and storage allow a grocery store in Alaska to offer fresh produce even when outside temperatures read minus 40 degrees. So I said, let's check this out. I mean, I'm just a little suspicious about some of this stuff. So let's check it out. I put in cost or fresh produce in Alaska. Seasonal fruits and vegetables. Finding produce in Alaska. There's a picture. Does that picture look like the picture on page 300? This guy's point is that in the wintertime, you're not going to find that much fresh produce in Alaska. You're going to find a few little bags of stuff. And I don't know if you can tell or not, but it looks like that's a head of lettuce or part of a head of lettuce. And it's 2 of them for $6. And you better get it while you can. If you Google, okay, do you think it costs more to buy fresh fruit in Alaska since it has to be shipped so far? It costs about twice as much. So if you pay $3 for a gallon of milk here, that same gallon of milk will probably cost you $6 in Alaska. So if you ever decide that someone said, wow, I just heard there was a job offer in Alaska where it pays a whole bunch of money, you better check it out before you move there, because it might be that it'll take more than your paycheck just to live there. And you can go on the internet and Google what does it cost for groceries in Alaska, and it's pretty much everything you look at will show you it's about twice what it is here if you can find it. They didn't add that to the picture for some reason. On page 300, it also shows a picture of world maize production. Let me turn this one off. Where is a lot of the world's maize produced?
America.
Do any of you live in that part of the United States? You know what they call maize up there? You won't hear people saying maize up in Iowa. It's called corn. Guess what corn is called in the rest of, what we call corn is called maize in the rest of the world. Did all of you know that? Well, now you know. If you go overseas and someone says, would you like to have some roasted maize? What are they offering you? Roasting ears? So take them up on it. scientific revolution in agriculture. New pesticides, it says on the right-hand column, save crops from insects that once wiped out entire harvest, and new fertilizers multiply yields per acre. In 1950, the average dairy cow gave 618 gallons of milk a year. Now, the average cow gives 2,537 gallons a year. In 1970, the average pig produced 6.7 piglets per year. By 2000, the piglet production was up to 16. Do you understand how we have used scientific technology to make our food supply more productive? Farm machinery has made it easier for one person to farm a whole lot of stuff. But let's go back to tomatoes, for example. One of the reasons tomatoes at the store don't, have you noticed how kind of hard they are compared to homegrown tomatoes or tomatoes from the garden? That's because if they raise the kind of tomatoes in a commercial tomato farm that you raise in your garden, when the machine goes through to pick them, it would crush them or bruise them. So the machine needs firmer tomatoes. So they basically develop a strain of tomato that's easier to be picked by tomato picking machinery, and it can be packed together without bruising each other and shipped longer distances. So the scientific community says it might not taste as good, but you get a cheaper tomato. And if you want that homegrown tomato taste, then guess what they're going to tell you to do? Grow your own tomatoes in your own home. Can't you even grow tomatoes in your house? Do any of you know some people who put in some grow lights and put some garden stuff under the grow lights and they pick cherry tomatoes for their salads? Do you do that? But you know people who do? Pretty cool stuff. Does this surprise you on page 301? Everyone know what ethanol is? There was a concern a few years ago about we're depleting the oil reserves. Once all the oil is gone, we won't have anything to make gasoline for our cars. So we need another source for automobile fuel. And they said, guess what? You can take plants and turn them into ethanol, especially corn. And then that means 10% of the gas that you use, it says up to 10% on the pump, is ethanol. But do you understand what happened? When an ethanol plant started buying that corn, then there wasn't as much corn to feed the cattle that they fatten up to sell in the market, and there wasn't enough corn to ship overseas. So there's a shortage of corn, so the price goes up because we've decided to use ethanol to run our automobiles. And then some guy tells me that ethanol can mess up your car if you have an older one. On page 301, it also shows a picture of a deforestation in Brazil where they have just taken whole sections of the forest and just bulldozed it and turned it into farmland. In fact, a number of years ago, Brazil actually said to America, can you come and teach us how to farm like you guys do in America? And they and of course, one of the things we did in this country, do you know this about your history? Okay, what states do you come from?
Texas.
Or
Texas? Okay, is there a school in Texas called Texas A&M?
Yes.
You know what the A and the M stand for? Anyone know? There used to be a Kansas A&M and an Oklahoma A&M. They changed their name from A&M to Oklahoma State University because in Oklahoma there's Oklahoma University and then there's Oklahoma State University. The State University was the old A&M College, agricultural and mechanical, and the university was where people went to learn to be doctors and lawyers and politicians and that kind of thing. And in America, every state had an agricultural and mechanical college, so people in that state could go to college and learn modern farming techniques and machinery techniques that would make them more productive. So Brazil said, can you tell us how we can be productive like you are? And guess what happened? In Brazil, they started opening up some colleges that are basically agricultural schools where they teach Brazilians how to be farmers like we farm here in the United States. And guess what they did? They started tearing down the forest and turning it into farmland and made Brazil exporter of food around the world. But now it says Brazil increased that because Brazil became more prosperous through selling crops, meat consumption increased threefold. So then you start eating more meat, which means you need more corn to feed the cattle if you want the meat to taste just right. And now people are saying they're destroying the Amazon forest and it's going to destroy the world. Now, I don't know if it will or not, but sometimes when I hear people going, the sky is falling, the sky is falling, I remember a story from my childhood. What was it, Chicken Little? Who said it's all falling apart. I guess what you have to do is when you read some of this stuff, you say, okay, it says by the year 2030, New Orleans is going to be underwater. Let's see, that's only 11 years away. I'll probably be in heaven by then, but you guys can check it out and tell the next geography teacher if it really did happen or not. On page 303, it talks about productivity continues to rise. The world yield of cereal crops has more than doubled. So it's not just in America and it's not just in Brazil, it's all around the world. High yield strains that grow more edible plant material often require more water and fertilizer. So we up the fertilizer and we need more water to make these plants produce all of this stuff it'll produce. I mean, that's why up in Iowa and Nebraska, where they raise a lot of corn, you'll see all these fields with these little circles where they have irrigation, because if they want their corn to be the most productive that it's capable of being, they need to feed it lots of water. In some places, it says on page 303, like the Philippines, where rice is grown, small farmers at first thrive with the new crops, despite the added cost for fertilizer. From 1960 to 70, the Philippines went from a net importer to a net exporter of rice. So now they're selling rice to other people, if the people can afford to buy it. On page 303, it talks about agriculture today, and it talks about subsistence agriculture, where agriculture to feed oneself and their family. So I just decided to Google something here. I'll show it to you. I thought it would be just fun to put up here. What did it say? Subsistence farming in the U.S. Subsistence farming in the U.S. And you know, when I clicked on these images, they show a whole bunch of people that's not here in the U.S. Hey, look at this. Planning a subsistence homestead. U.S. Department of Agriculture. Do you realize that you can order from the U.S. Department of Agriculture a farmer's bulletin that tells you how to plan a subsistence homestead? How you can actually decide that I'm going to, what is subsistence? It's providing food and stuff for myself. Do you remember when we were back in one of the previous chapters where we talked about populations in cities and migrations? Did any of you come across stuff that talked about where Detroit used to be where they built all these automobiles and then they abandoned Detroit? So isn't the population in Detroit about half of what it was at one time? And in some parts of Detroit, it's like where there used to be 5 houses, now there's 1. So you know what that says to the guy who still lives there in Detroit? There's a bunch of empty lots around me that nobody is using. Any idea what somebody in Detroit, in the heart of Detroit, decided to do with those empty lots? Any idea what some people in Kansas City have decided to do with the empty lots in the inner city? Turn them into gardens where people who live around there can come and plant stuff, and we become little city subsistence farmers. There's some more stuff down here too. History of agriculture in the United States. We talked about that earlier, about the Homestead Act, and people have their own land to raise crops. But see, the Homestead Act wasn't just for you to be a subsistence farmer. It was for you to raise crops and sell crops and make America a profitable nation. If you want to do subsistence farming, all you have to do is carve up your yard that you used to have to get tired of mowing the grass in, plant some vegetables, plant some fruits. Say, so there's my fruits and vegetables. What am I going to do for bacon and eggs for breakfast? Go out behind your house and build a little, you can buy it at the Tractor Supply, a little chicken house, put in your backyard and put some chickens in there, and there you'll be your eggs. What are you going to do about bacon? Well, I guess you're going to have to find someone in the country who will let you keep a pig there and feed it for you. And then once it gets big enough, have any of you had the privilege of taking a pig out of a pen and turning it into ham and bacon? Have you done that?
I haven't killed it, but I've been there.
You didn't kill it. You let them kill it, and then you went out and helped scrape all the hair off of it and cut it up in pieces.
Yeah.
And hang it up in a smokehouse. Don't you feel sorry for the rest of these people? They would.
It was fun.
It
was cold.
They would starve to death while you and I are having bacon and eggs, and they would smell our food, and they would come over to our house and say, "Hey, can we have some of that?" And we say, "We'll sell you a pig." Well, I don't know how to do that. Oh, wait a minute. Hey, if all these people want bacon and eggs, let's sell them some of our eggs, and let's sell them some of our bacon, and then we'll use that money to buy some more pigs and some more chicken houses, and before you know it, we've turned ourselves into a little business enterprise and not just subsistence farming, because people came to us to buy some of the stuff. I used to buy milk because I grew up on a farm where I called it fresh milk. Anyone grow up in an area where you drank fresh milk? Okay, when we had a little child, my wife went to the doctor and the pediatrician and asked about the fresh milk I was buying from this dairy farmer. And her doctor said, "Oh no, don't do that to your child. Raw milk is dangerous." So we had to start going to the store and buying what I called chalk water. Have any of you tasted 1%, 0.5% milk? Okay, what's the point of calling it milk? Okay, whole milk in the grocery store. When I was raised on fresh, raw milk from a cow, whole milk tasted worse than 0.5% stuff. That's how much better. Whole milk, you take it right out of the cow, you carry it in the house, you put it in the refrigerator. The next morning, the top third of the gallon jug is cream that you scoop off and turn it into butter, or just put it on something to eat that you put cream on. Put it on some strawberries or some fruit. I mean, it's just amazing. Subsistence agriculture, I mean, sometimes you see articles where they look down at it like, oh, how sad this is that these people are subsistence farmers. They say, wait a minute, these people are taking care of themselves and providing for themselves. And if you don't want to be a subsistence farmer, if you don't want to provide your own stuff, then there's probably enough farmers around here that are doing it. Have any of you been to the Belton Farmers Market? Well, it's closed in the wintertime, I think, because stuff only grows in the summer. Go to the farmer's market someday just to see what stuff costs. And if the prices are too high, go back right before they close the market down and watch what people do to their prices. They drop the price toward the end of the day because they don't want to take it home and have to throw it away. Although, if they don't sell all of their sweet corn that they brought in to sell, they know, they smile, and someone says, "You're going to throw this stuff away?" And they go, "No, I'm going to take it home and feed it to the chickens and the pigs." That's what a subsistence farmer does. He has other things that he can use with that stuff, the stuff that he doesn't sell. But see, once he starts selling it, he's moved from being a subsistence farmer into a commercial farmer. And then all of a sudden, my cousin in Oklahoma doesn't have time for a garden now because he farms so much land where he raises just wheat that he's a mega wheat farmer, but he makes enough money from selling his wheat that he can buy all the stuff that a subsistence farmer would raise. And again, in early America, I mean, I used to go to my grandfather's house, and there it was, his 160 acres that he had it was my great grandfather that he had homesteaded. He had a garden, he had a chicken house, he had a little pasture where he kept milk cows, and then he had part of his acreage was where he raised wheat, and he raised some hay to feed his livestock in the wintertime. Then he raised some wheat that he would sell to have cash to buy stuff that he didn't raise on his farm, like sugar and salt. He didn't have to buy flour because he could take his wheat and make his own flour. Have any of you ever taken wheat and put it in a grinder and made your own flour? Have you done that, Anna? And then did you bake bread?
I don't know if we baked something with it. I don't know what.
Did it taste good?
Yeah.
I just saw on television recently, I think it was Channel 19, this cooking show where they were interviewing a guy out in New York City who has decided that the best way to make bread is not to buy flour, but to buy wheat. And the very day he makes the bread, he grinds the wheat and turns it into flour and makes bread. And this guy was tasting it and he said, wow, you can really taste the difference. Most of us don't have that even those of us who grew up on a wheat farm, we didn't think of taking the wheat and making flour. We would just sell it all in town. Well, not all of it. We kept out enough to plant next year's wheat crop, but we would sell the rest of it in town and then go to the grocery store and buy flour. Because where is flour packaged? Does anyone know where your favorite package of flour comes from? Pillsbury Mills? What's the headquarters for Pillsbury? Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, someplace up there? They took wheat and turned it into flour and then bleached it and convinced the whole world, or all of the United States, that that's the way you should eat flour. Flour should be bleached white flour. It's like, no, just take the grains of wheat and make your own and enjoy eating on a whole new level. It says on page 304, modern commercial farming relies on substantial capital investment in machinery, chemicals, improved seeds, and livestock. The high price of farm machinery necessitates that it be used maximally, and this encourages an ever-increasing average farm size. The bigger your machinery, the more land you have to support that machinery. I saw an article of after my dad died, my mom married this guy she went to high school with, and after he died, one of his relatives saw my profile of him on ancestry.com, and he sent me some information, and there was a newspaper article about his father, which if he would have been my birth father, it would have been my grandfather. His father was farming with horses and horse-drawn equipment, and when they said, why don't you buy a tractor? And what he said was, if I bought a tractor, I would have to farm more land to support the tractor. My horses and my machinery are big enough to take care of the farm that I own. So unless I get a bigger farm, which I don't plan to do, I can spend the rest of my life farming with horses and horse-drawn equipment. But once you start using machinery, then you want to get it bigger and bigger and bigger, and the bigger it is, the more land you have to support it. Page 306 talks about intensive rice farming. Have any of you ever traveled someplace in the world where you've seen in real life something that looks like this picture on page 306 in the bottom right hand corner, where they go up on a mountainside and build terraces and plant rice and fill those terraces up with water? So how come if they do double cropping in India, how come India has so many people who don't have enough to eat?
Because they sell it.
What?
Because they sell it.
And then they don't have enough, they didn't keep enough back for their own family to live on? But aren't there a lot of people in India who live in cities where they're not raising any crops? They actually moved from the farm to town looking for a job. So now they live someplace where they can't raise all those crops. Oh yeah, but look at the size of India and look at the size of the United States. And remember, go back and compare those populations again. And you go, oh, they've got too many people to raise all that food. Or if they're going to raise it, they're going to have to work harder at being productive in what farmland they do have. On page 307, it talks about prairie cereal farming. That would be in the prairies. That's the Midwest here. The flatlands where they took the grassland. And any idea why an early farmer in the Midwest was called a sod buster? Because he broke up the sod to turn it into productive farmland. And since there were no trees out there in the Great Plains, he took the sod that he was breaking up and used it to build a house. Over in Greece, when I was over there and I went up into the mountains to see where people used to farm, it was just like the mountains are all just piles of rocks. But if you pick up the rocks and use them to build a house, then what's left is some productive land where you can plant a garden. And one time when I was in Greece, I was riding a little scooter up to look at some of the farming areas, because I'm a farmer at heart. And when I was coming back down, I said to the guy at the hotel where I was staying, I said, so how come they've let all that farmland just go back into grass? And he said, because a farmer can make more money coming down here to the coast and working in a shop selling stuff to tourists than he can make being a farmer all winter long. So he just lets his field go back to grass and lets goats and sheep eat on it, and then he comes down here and works in the store and then uses the money from the store to buy whatever crops he used to raise on his little farm. And so that little island in Greece imports a lot of their grain. But they still have people, because it's in the Mediterranean, they still have people on that island who raise fruits and vegetables and sell them at their little markets and roadside stands. And if you ever get a chance to go to Greece, actually if you're in Europe, I was in Germany and there was a guy selling gyros. Have any of you ever bought a gyro from Arby's? Okay, Arby's is selling them 2 for $6. Get a friend to go with you and order a gyro from Arby's. It's pretty close to what you could buy in Greece at a roadside stand. Page 308 talks about ranching. Those of you from Texas, did you live close to anybody that was a rancher? How do you recognize a rancher's truck in the parking lot? You don't know. When you walk by, it smells funny. It smells funny to you. You know what it smells like to the rancher? It smells like money to him. Have any of you driven through Iowa on the interstate and rolled the window down to get some fresh air? Right next to a pig farm? And you go, whoa, shut the window. And it's like, that might be a bad smell to you, but to the pig farmer, that smells like money. Mediterranean agriculture, we've talked about that already. All those fruits and vegetables. Plantation farming. Now, the book talks about plantation farming in America and that it's all over because slavery has ended. But when I read stuff in here, this is the beauty of the internet. You just go check it out. So what did plantation farming in 2019. In 2019. See what we get. How to make millions? Oh, that's from plantain farming. Well, which one was it? I didn't put down. Well, that's a bummer. See if that. Criticisms, farm and home, sugar, rubber. No, let's go back to another one. Well, I'm probably going to just have to quit this one and find it at home and put it up on, see if I can put it on my what? Twitter. See if I can upload it to Twitter. Because what it talks about is all the plantation, all the stuff that comes from plantations. And, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Well, we'll go back there. Yeah, it'll come back, won't it? No, it isn't. Well, maybe we don't need it anymore because we're running out of time. Then I'll see if I can get that and put it up on Twitter. But it talks about plantations in the past, but there's still a lot of plantations today. And would this surprise you? One of your favorite beverages comes mostly from plantations where some big landowner makes most of the money and local people who work on that coffee farm to pick those beans make a pittance for a living. Better check to see where your coffee's coming from. That's also true of tea and some other things that we eat on a regular basis. I'll look that up. I'll make it a point to find that and see if I can upload it to the Twitter page. Page 310. What determines agricultural productivity? What is this person doing in this picture on page 310?
Pulling board.
She's tapping a rubber tree in Indonesia. Does anyone know who took over a lot of the Indonesian rubber plants? English colonists. And then some of them snuck some rubber plants out of Indonesia illegally to try to plant them and start a rubber plantation someplace else in the world. But sadly enough, this little girl who's harvesting this rubber doesn't make very much money. And the people selling the rubber to all the people who need it, you say, who needs rubber? Have you ever driven a car? Have you ever driven a wagon or anything with other than rubber tires? Have you ever been to Old Missouri Town or to or in Iowa to a city where they have wagons. Do you ever look to see what kind of wheels are on the wagons? Wooden wheels with a steel rim around it. Well, today we want rubber tires on everything because it's so much more comfortable to drive and to ride in. Livestock around the world. Humans began to domesticate animals about the same time as they did plants, some 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. Well, isn't that interesting? That sounds like what? When Adam and Eve were put on this earth and told to dress and keep the garden, and then when they were put out of the garden, they were given all this stuff for food, and then there were some restrictions put on them for what they couldn't eat. Maybe you can trace our human ancestry back to those early livestock days. And if someone had you say, how in the world do they get cows to produce that much more milk? Well, what do you think? They have a cow that produces more milk, and then they try to have more offspring from that cow, and then take those that produce more milk and just keep working at it till they've got a whole strain of cattle who produce huge quantities of milk. Oh yeah, but if you take that milk from that cow that produces all that milk every day and you put it in a jug and let it set overnight, it'll have a little bit of cream on the top. In fact, you'll see most of those dairies that produce all that milk, they use Holsteins, black and white cows. We never had any black and white milk cows on our farm. We had brown ones because the milk they give is richer and it has more cream in it. Because you use the cream for making butter and for making other things as well. I am so glad I grew up eating homemade ice cream. If you've never had a chance to taste it, you can't get it anymore because you can't use raw milk. Page 313. What do you think about this? Over 1/3 of the world's total grain harvest is fed to livestock. Why would that be?
We have a lot of livestock.
Because we love our livestock. Have you ever eaten a steak produced from a range-raised cow? Have you eaten steak produced from a cow that was put in a feedlot and fed corn for a few weeks to fatten them up? Which one?
Range.
You like the range better? Oh man, I like all that marbling that creates all that fat. It's an acquired taste, I think. And when I was growing up, that's all I ate was range beef. Because we raised them in the pasture, but we never put them in a lot and fed them corn or anything. It'd be too expensive. You just take them off the pasture, and when you run out of beef, you take a young one out of the pasture and harvest it and eat it. And by the way, when you eat chicken, which chickens do you cook? The ones who quit laying eggs. That's the ones you cook. Well, I think maybe on page 314, I better save that for next time, because it tells you if you're going to use grain to produce meat, because you have such an appetite for meat, it tells you that chicken is your most efficient grain converter to meat. Yeah, it figures. And pork is next, and beef is the worst. So which tastes better?
Beef.
Chicken or a T-bone steak? I mean, the more grain it takes to fatten it up, the better it tastes. All right. See you on Wednesday. We'll finish up this chapter and start chapter 9.